Hi, I'm Gary, and this is episode 259 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking at more questions and answers. This season of the podcast is sponsored by Zapmap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence wherever you go. Before we start, just a very quick update. I'm currently putting the finishing touches to a new update on my ebook, So You've Gone Electric. So You've Gone Electric. It's virtually a page one rewrite to the book with new chapters, lots of updates, new photos. Since the last version was released prior to lockdown in 2020, the EV and charging environment has changed so much. A lot of what was in the book was outdated, and it certainly needed a fresh coat of paint. Anyone who has already bought a version of this through Amazon will receive the update automatically, I believe, when it gets released, which should be between this season and the next season, so probably sometime in late June, early July. As usual, if you don't have this book or my other book, So You've Gone Renewable, you can get them both on the Kindle store, and links are in the show notes. Moving on. Today we've got another question and answer session. Back in episode 208, season 11, I had a Q&A episode. In that episode, we had a number of guests come in and answer the sort of questions that I see on social media all the time around EV adoption, etc. We asked and answered questions such as, are EV sales falling off a cliff? When will we see public wireless charging? What's the best way of getting receipts from CPOs now that all the units are contactless, etc. Now, if you want to go back and listen to that, the link is in the show notes. So I had a word with my patrons and asked them whether they wanted another Q&A episode, and surprise, surprise, they said yes. So here we are. In this episode, I'm going to be answering a number of questions, sometimes by myself and sometimes with the help of a knowledgeable industry insider. We'll be asking a number of different questions, but we'll be finishing off by asking a semi-philosophical question. Why do some public chargers want you to plug in before authenticating for payment, and others want you to authenticate for payment before plugging in? So here we go. First question. What does the ZEV mandate, and in particular the recent review, mean for UK car manufacturers? Is it moving the goalposts? Is it changing targets? Well, for this, I'm going to bring in Vicky Edmonds from our first episode of the season.
Yeah, so I think it's Andy Eastlake, who's one of our members, but he is a transport and energy engineer, and I think and James Vickery, who's sort of the head of kind of the CO2 regulations in OZEV, was there as well. Yeah, so I think what Andy spelled out is that I think there's this misconception in the media that the ZEV mandate is all about reversing these targets. And some of that is driven by some of the discussions in the media before Christmas. But what the consultation has clearly said is we're not talking about changing the overarching targets of the ZEV mandate. There are sort of two points around that. One is we're talking about easing the cost of transition to the industry. So is there something we can do with the flexibilities that are in the first couple of years where auto manufacturers can trade between types of vehicle and types of credit? And then there's that question that between 2030 and 2035, so 2030 is when all fully kind of petrol and diesel cars are due to be phased out. So that's when you have 80% electrification on the road, but that still includes plug-in hybrids or hybrids. And that definition of what's still included from 2030 to 2035 when we are all fully electric. So all new cars have to be fully electric. So that 5-year period, what cars are to be included in that? And those are the two sort of the technical questions that are in the ZEV mandate. And then the part that we in EVA are focused on, there is a question in there around, it's a demand, they call it demand side measures, but it's actually measures that ease the cost of transition to the consumer. And that is because at the moment, manufacturers are providing those measures because the old plug-in car grant no longer exists. So they're discounting the cost of the cars, and the sort of the discussion in the press is that that's proving to be unaffordable, and obviously that's going to be the case for a couple of years. So is there anything more government can do to ease those costs? And that's about the consumer feeling able to afford the cars and then afford ownership of the car. So that's where we're going to focus in on, okay, well, what measures could we ask for that ease those costs? So the cost of purchase, so there are some taxation measures that we might look at, and some spend measures, but also the cost of ownership, which is the charging cost that we've discussed. Is there anything more that government can do to bring those costs of ownership down slightly for the consumer. And so those are the two areas that we're going to focus on as part of the ZEV mandate. And I say one last thing, it's quite rare for government to put these open questions into a consultation that's so far down the line, where you're talking about a specific instrument and you're in the middle of a policy that's been going on for decades, and you've taken away some of those demand measures because you thought the market was doing well. The market's not doing as well as you thought, so now you're having to rethink. And so it's quite a rare situation to be in, and a good opportunity for us to push some of the things that some of our members and other drivers out there that are really niggling at them when it comes to the costs.
We'll cover costs a little later on in the show. Second question, kilowatt and kilowatt hour. What's the difference and why are things so confusing? Now, this is a personal bugbear of mine. Although many people, including some who are quite high up in the EV world, don't seem to understand the difference. So let me see if I can give you a little explanation. Regular listeners to the podcast will know that I drove Porsche 911s for 10 years in my younger days. 3.6 litre, flat six, boxer engine, 0 to 60 in around 5 seconds, and a blisteringly fast top speed on track, obviously, of 155 miles per gallon. As I used to say, it passed everything except the petrol stations. Now, the listeners who are paying attention will have spotted what I just did. I used a measure of consumption instead of a measure of speed, and this obviously is ridiculous. Speed is measured in miles per hour, not miles per gallon. Sure, they're similar when you say them, but if you went to a car dealership and said, what's the fuel economy of this car? And they replied 34 miles per hour, you'd seriously question whether they knew what they were talking about. So why is it any different with electric vehicles? Kilowatt hour is a measure of energy capacities, how much energy is stored in your battery. Kilowatt is a measure of power. It's how quickly your motor is turning or how quickly your battery is charging or discharging. To put it another way, let's do the bathtub analogy. If you have a bathtub with a tap running, the water is filling the bath at a certain rate. The bath contains a certain volume of water. The measure of the water coming out of the tap is litres per minute. The measure of the amount of water that has accumulated in the bath is litres. If you're old school and like imperial measures, feel free to substitute gallons and fluid ounces here. The measure of the power going into your battery is kilowatts. The measure of the amount of energy stored in your battery is kilowatt hour. 1 kilowatt of power put into a battery for 1 hour will give you 1 kilowatt hour of stored energy. So when it comes to working out how efficient an EV is, we measure the amount of distance travelled on a given amount of energy. Just as we did with fossil fuel cars, we measure the distance travelled on a specific amount of petrol. So for petrol, it's miles per gallon, and for EVs, it's miles per kilowatt hour. Of course, in Europe, they do it a little differently, and they calculate it inversely, the amount used for a given measure of distance. This is litres per 100 kilometres for petrol and kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres for EVs. Does that make sense? So the next question, when will battery electric vehicles and internal combustion engine vehicles achieve price parity? So here's a question. Why is it that Kia make 3 versions of the Niro, a mild hybrid, i.e. petrol version, a plug-in hybrid, and an electric version, and they're all completely different prices? You would think that they would be more or less the same price. Let's ignore the plug-in hybrid version for the moment. The wet fuel version needs an engine, a transmission, a gearbox, and a fuel tank, and there is a cost associated with all of these things, as anyone who's ever had to replace a gearbox will tell you. So if you throw those things out, the price should drop. But then you need to add in batteries, a motor or two, and an inverter and a couple of other little electronic gizmos, and that will bring the price back up. But when it does, the price it brings it up to is higher than what the price was with the internal combustion engine. So does it mean that batteries are more expensive than car engines and gearboxes? Well, the short answer is yes. And the longer answer is, well, they always used to be more expensive, but the price is rapidly decreasing. So as a result, electric vehicles are becoming cheaper over time. In some cases, they have reached or even beaten price parity with internal combustion engine vehicles. The Dacia Spring is £15,000 brand new on the road. Now, for comparison, the cheapest brand new Ford you can buy in England, the Ford Puma, is £21,716 recommended retail price and £26,580 on the road. That's a big difference. That's almost £12,000 different. So how is it done? Well, the Dacia Spring is a far more basic car than the Puma. In terms of power, it has a small, therefore cheaper battery, and a small motor. It has a low power inverter, so the charge speed isn't high, and it doesn't have a lot of added extras, such as some of the fancy tech you'll find on other cars. It's built with cheaper materials, there's a lot of scratchy plastic in there. It has a physical handbrake, not an electronic one like many of the modern cars. Things like storage and cup holders are optional paid extras. And all of these things mean the price is lower. But even then, we have slightly more interesting cars such as the Renault 5, which is priced at £27,000 on the road and has a newer version coming later this year with a smaller battery and less powerful motor, priced at £22,000 on the road. Note these prices in relation to the £26,580 price of the Ford Puma, Britain's best-selling car last year. Taking this one step further, we have a new concept vehicle called the Slate. It's backed by Jeff Bezos from Amazon, and it's a fully functional, modular build electric pickup truck, which you will be able to buy for $20,000, which is around £16,000. Now, just to put that into perspective, the current best-selling pickup truck in the US is the Ford F-150, which retails at a starting price of $37,250. The full electric version of that vehicle starts a few dollars short of $50,000. The Slate is modular, which means you decide what you want to include or exclude on the build. Obviously, the more you add to it, the more it will cost. But it does mean you're not paying for things you don't want. Want a bigger battery? Yep, you can do that. But it's got manual wind windows, there's no infotainment screen, you have to use your phone. It's clad in pre-printed plastic panels. Today's tongue twister, try saying that 3 times quickly. And this means it isn't painted, which cuts costs from that point of view. Now, as an added aside, if you've ever wondered why millionaire Jeff Bezos elected to invest in a company called Slate that made electric vehicles, just play the anagram game with the word slate and see what you come up with. So, I think it's fair to say nowadays that the price differential between battery and petrol cars is negligible in the sectors in which most people buy them from new. Of course, most people don't buy new cars. They're the remit of companies and fleets. People tend to buy second-hand cars. Even there, EVs are now starting to become more and more competitively priced. I spoke with Colin Walker, former guest of the podcast and head of transport at ECIU, about this.
80% of us buy our cars second-hand, so the second-hand market has got a vital role to play if most of us are going to be able to make the move to electric driving. And the market is growing rapidly. In the last 12 months, EV sales on the second-hand market increased 59%. And the other good news is that EVs have also reached price parity with their petrol equivalents on the used market. This means that there is no price penalty for buying an EV over a petrol if you're doing it second-hand, which means you can start making savings the moment you drive it off the forecourt. We at ECIU recently did some research and found that the average second-hand electric vehicle can save its owners £1,600 a year over its equivalent petrol vehicle, meaning the savings are very substantial if you choose to get an EV second-hand.
Next question, why shouldn't you charge past 80% on a rapid charger? We've looked at this a couple of times in previous episodes, and it seems there are still people who are looking for more clarification on the way charging works in an EV. Now, I like to use the wine glass analogy. You know me, I'm all about the analogies. If I give you a bottle of wine in a tall glass and ask you to fill it to the brim without spilling any, here's what you'd probably do. You'd pour the wine into the bottom of the bottle as quickly as you could to start with. There's plenty of room in there and it'll fill up fairly quickly. As you start to fill more and more of the glass, you'll start to slow down the rate at which you're pouring the wine into the glass. And when you get to the last few centimetres at the top, chances are you'll just be trickling the wine in at a really slow rate to get as much in as possible without spilling. So you started fast, gradually slowed down, then trickled almost to a stop, right? Well, surprise, surprise, the same thing happens with charging your car on a rapid charger. When you first plug the car in and it's empty or virtually empty, it's quite easy to push in power at a relatively high rate and fill the first 30, 40, 50%, etc. But as you get more and more towards full, the charge speed will slow down, like the last centimetre or so of the wine glass, to ensure the battery is protected. As a general rule of thumb, and this varies depending on the car and the conditions, 80% state of charge is the point at which the charger will start to slow down dramatically. After that, it's charging at a really slow speed. Even on a 350 kilowatt charge, you might only be charging at 22, 23, 24 kilowatts in some cars. Now, there are two downsides to this. The first is that it will take quite a long time to add that extra 20% to the battery to leave it fully charged. And secondly, that time means that you're effectively blocking that charger for someone who might need a charge more urgently. What this does is it cuts down utilization of a charger. You might only put in 10 kilowatt hours in 30 minutes, but another car on the same charger might put 50 kilowatt hours in the same time. And this is important because it increases utilization. And we'll come back to utilization in a later question. Now, in fact, it's so slow to do that last 20% that it's often quicker to stop the charge at 80, continue driving for a while, and when your state of charge has dropped down to a lower value, 20% or so, pop in for another quick charge to get that extra that you might need. The time you spend adding an extra 20% when the battery is at 20% state of charge is a lot less than adding the same 20% when your battery is at 80% state of charge. And for that reason, it's recommended that you stop charging at 80% on a rapid charger. If I go back to the wine glass analogy, you rarely fill the glass right to the very top. You tend to stop a centimetre or so from the rim. Same thing. Now, when we say 80%, it's not a strict 80%. It's the point at which the charger starts to dramatically restrict the charge speed. Could be 75%, could be 80, could be 85%. But for a generic term, we call it 80% state of charge. The other aspect of 80% relates to the battery chemistry. If you're charging your car overnight, whether on a home charger or a public charger, you're generally advised not to charge above 80%. And this is because batteries that contain cobalt, the NMC or nickel manganese cobalt versions, don't like to sit at 100% state of charge for any length of time. If you're going to be driving off in the morning and using the battery, that's absolutely fine. But if you've no plans to move the car and you've just charged it up so it's ready for if you do need it, then 80% is usually enough to give you range without potentially damaging the battery. Now, this doesn't apply if your battery is a lithium iron phosphate one, also known as LFP. They're a different chemical composition and they don't mind being fully charged. Generally, if you have a Chinese-made car, especially a more modern one, it's probably going to be lithium iron phosphate. Some of the lowest spec Teslas are also LFP. As an exercise, when you go and look for a car, ask the dealer what chemistry the battery is. If he doesn't know, that's an indication that they're not actually that well educated on electric vehicles. So question 3, or is it question 4? Who cares? It's the next question. Why is public charging so expensive? Now, obviously, this is of great interest to people who are living with an electric car but don't have home charging. With the right overnight tariffs, your cost is down to around 7 pence a kilowatt hour. But on public charging, you can be paying up to 10 or even 12 times that. As at the time of writing, the Zapmap price index puts public rapid charging at an average of 76 pence a kilowatt hour. But this takes into account all the different charge point operators and how much they charge, and it's a weighted average price per kilowatt hour based on the pay-as-you-go price per network and the estimated total kilowatt hours delivered by each network over the month. But that's a little like saying the price of a kilo of carrots is £1 based on the average price of all supermarkets in the UK. That's accurate, but of course, people don't shop at all the supermarkets. They shop at the ones they're loyal to. If you're a Waitrose fan or a Marks & Spencer fan, you're going to be paying a little more for your groceries than if you shop at places like Aldi and Lidl. The average across these supermarkets is weighted by the price of the highest and the number of people who buy there. I'm sure if I went to Hampstead or Richmond and calculated the average price of a bag of groceries, it would be more than my mother in West Yorkshire pays. Does it mean that the weighted average is wrong? No, but it does mean that specific circumstances can alter the price for an individual. Now, I charged recently for 39 pence a kilowatt hour on ultra-rapid charging. It wasn't on Tesla sites either. It was AW Energy's site in Checkley Wood near Leighton Buzzard. Listen to episode 257 for more on that. AC charging charge point operator Chargey offer 39 pence a kilowatt hour for overnight 7 kilowatt charging using lamppost charging at their locations. But if you compare that with, say, Shell Recharge's offerings for their high-powered chargers, we can see that they're up around 89 pence a kilowatt hour. And this is for the same basic unit of energy, a kilowatt hour. So my advice to you is to check out cheaper alternatives if you can. Now, we covered things like subscriptions on episode 225 last season. An Ionity subscription, for example, can get you ultra-rapid charging across the UK and Europe for around 43 pence a kilowatt hour. So what is it that causes prices to be much more expensive than home charging? Well, let's make sure we're comparing apples and oranges, or the Starbucks comparison, as I like to call it. You can sit in your expensive house for which you're paying a large chunk of money in either mortgage or rent, and you can use your expensive coffee maker and your home-roasted Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee beans and end up with a cup of coffee that costs you, say, 75 pence when you account for the cost of the beans and the milk. This is, of course, far less expensive than the same cup of coffee when you go to Starbucks. What you haven't taken into account is that the coffee in your house didn't just come into being out of nowhere. To get the full price of the coffee, you need to apportion an amount of the rent or the mortgage, the price of the electricity, the cost of your labour, council tax, etc., etc. In reality, your 75 pence cup of coffee probably costs a lot more than that. You just don't do the same economic calculations as Starbucks do. They work all that out: rent, labour, fixtures and fittings, raw materials, electricity, and that gets priced into the cup of coffee. It's the same with rapid charging. You look at the price you can get for overnight home charging, around 7 pence a kilowatt hour, and compare it to the cost of public rapid charging at anything up to 89 pence a kilowatt hour, as we've just identified. But again, you aren't comparing like for like. For a start, your electricity isn't really 7 pence a kilowatt hour. It's 25 pence or 30 pence a kilowatt hour, whatever the price cap is, because that's the domestic rate for energy coming into your house. The fact that you can get a cheaper rate from your supplier isn't because the electricity is so much cheaper. I mean, it is cheaper, but it's not that much cheaper every night of the year. And companies such as OVO Energy provide 24/7 charging at 7 pence a kilowatt hour. So they're obviously losing some money somewhere with that. So your basis of calculation is wrong. On top of that, you have a location in which to charge. You've paid for that in either rent or a mortgage. You've probably also paid a chunk of money to have a charger installed. But what you're not doing is apportioning those costs out for every kilowatt hour of energy you charge. And the reason you're not doing that is because those costs are sunken costs. You will pay them even if you didn't have an electric car to charge at home, and that's fair enough. But someone like Instavolt, who've just spent millions on their Winchester Superhub, don't have that luxury. They have to apportion those costs and the costs of all of their other charging sites, head office, helpline, the maintenance function, across all their chargers and all their provided energy. Not to mention that the price they pay for energy is substantially more expensive than the 7 pence a kilowatt hour you're paying overnight. And they have to charge 20% VAT instead of the 5% VAT you pay at home. And we talked in great detail about this in episode 186, the charger pricing episode. So check that out if you want more information. But the short answer to why is public charging so much more expensive is because there are costs they account for that you don't at home. In fact, I did a quick exercise. I calculated how many kilowatt hours per year I charge at home. And I also calculated the annual costs for running my house: mortgage, council tax, bills that are necessary for actually running the house, not including charging the car. So heating, water, electricity, maintenance. I also amortized the cost of my charger over an 8-year period. And I then divided one into the other and added the peak rate for my electricity. And it seems it's actually costing me well over 30 pence a kilowatt hour to charge at home. If I recalculate my electricity based on a VAT rate of 20%, not 5%, the costs go up to nearly 35 pence a kilowatt hour. The interesting thing is that if I then double the amount of charging that I do in a year, the effective price per kilowatt hour drops to below 30 pence. So when CPOs say that increased utilization leads to lower charging costs, that's what they mean. Now, linking this back to the previous question on charging to 80%, this means that jumping off and freeing up a charger allows more energy to be dispensed from that charger, resulting in higher utilization and lower prices in the longer term. So, on to my semi-philosophical question. Why do some public chargers want you to plug in before authenticating for payment, and others want you to authenticate for payment before plugging in? As an ex-petrol pump attendant back in the day, The system to start the pump going was triggered by the user lifting the nozzle from the cradle. In fact, on the really, really old pumps, you had to lift the nozzle and then flick a lever on the side to actually start it going. Even when we moved to contactless payment, it was still the same. You lifted the nozzle and the screen sprang to life. So when it came to authenticating payment for charges, what happened? When I talk about authenticating payment, I mean providing either a contactless card, an RFID card, a fob, or an app. Well, different CPOs do it different ways. There are still many that do it the wet fuel way. Connect the charger to your car, authenticate your payment, and off you go. But there are others, Instavolt for example, who do it the other way. You need to authenticate that you can pay before connecting the charger, especially if you're using their app. So which is best? And why do they do it different ways? Well, intuitively, I think people want to do it the wet fuel way. Plug in, sort out your payment, and the charger starts. But if you think about it at the moment, there are reasons why this isn't the best way. We spoke with Liz Allen in the mid-season roundtable, and she discussed the customer experience at chargers.
Because honestly, when I plug my car in, I don't want to be thinking about back office systems or fault management processes or payment systems or whatever. I just want it to work. I want to feel confident that I won't be stranded, that the app will behave if I need to use it, that I won't be hit with unexpected costs like through pre-auth fees, and that if something does go wrong, someone actually cares enough to fix it. So yet, too often, it's not always the reality. The basics still aren't consistent, and that erodes trust from the drivers, and also if it's a revenue sharing model from those people who are involved, the other stakeholders, which is something the EV sector desperately needs if we're serious about widespread adoption. So my question is, how do we make sure the driver's real everyday experience becomes the starting point for everything else?
One thing Liz talked about there was the fact that often you need to try several times to get the payment authenticated. This means that if you're connecting, authenticating, then charging, you'll need to replace the charger cable each time and start again. If you're not able-bodied, or perhaps, like me, a little older, this could be an issue. Whereas if you have to authenticate first, it means that you can get that sorted before having to deal with the hassle of sorting out heavy cables. Of course, as we said in episode 254, the plug and charge episode, if everyone implemented plug and charge, all this would go away. Just plug in and walk away. No pre-authorization issues, no validation problems, no connection issues. Simple. So those were the questions and answers for this season. If you like this sort of episode, let me know. I can do one every season, but only if you send in the questions you want answered. As usual, you can contact me at info@evmusings.com. It's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with you listeners. Royal Enfield's first e-motorcycle lands early 2026 in the US for under $8,000. Royal Enfield will launch its first electric motorcycle, the C6, in early 2026 for under $8,000. The C6 features a retro design inspired by 1940s military bike, and it offers customizable ride modes with a scrambler version called the S6, which will also be part of the lineup. It looks absolutely fantastic in the photos, and I can see Sarah Sloman hacking around the streets of a village in the Cotswolds in one of these. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by Zapmap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence. Zapmap is free to download and use with subscription plans for enhanced features, such as using Zapmap in-car on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, and discounted charging across thousands of charge points. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. It was put together this week with the help of Vicky Edmonds, Colin Walker, and Liz Allen. Many thanks to them for their help. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general musings to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. On the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at evmusings, where I post short videos and podcast extracts regularly. Why not follow me there? Thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. If you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/evmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks. So you've gone electric, and so you've gone renewable. They're 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on Amazon. Check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. I know you're probably driving or walking or jogging now, but if you can remember, and you enjoy this episode, drop a review in iTunes, please. It really helps me out. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by messaging me at musingsev.bsky.social with the words, "Just one more question, sir." Hashtag if you know, nothing else. Thanks as always to my co-founder Simon. He's getting more and more sophisticated drones for his video work. Ones that can follow him, leading, circle him, all automatically. It's a big difference from the time when he needed to be able to see the screen and control the drone and ride the electric unicycle. Too many crashes were a factor in why he bought this new drone. It's a result of one too many times running his unicycle battery down to nothing on a remote country bridleway.
I just want it to work. I want to feel confident that I won't be stranded.
Thanks for listening. Bye.